We are ready to begin our pre-show portion. It's great to have so many of you here, and I'm so happy that my friend Andres Zintars is now a member as of today. Just a reminder that at 2 o'clock we will be selling for $5 soup from today, and that's about it. Now I'm going to hand it over to Datsa Weinberg, who's talking about the virtual museum, and she actually prepared in Latvian, so I'm not sure which language she's going to do this in.
I did ask. Okay, I know I have very few minutes. There's no place to put my timer. Okay. So, labdien visi, kas te klāt, un visi, kas ir kaut kur citur ēterā. Man ļoti liels prieks, ka es šeit varēju būt, un paldies Toronto Latviešu pensionāru apvienībai par iespēju jūs uzrunāt. Labi. Tēma šodien ir par Kanādas latviešu virtuālo muzeju, un mans uzdevums jums pastāstīt par šo jauno elenākā projektu. Tā būs lapa, kas dzīvos internetā. Tas nebūs fizisks muzejs ar telpām un taustamiem eksponātiem. So I will summarize that quickly. I'm here on behalf of the Latvian National Federation in Canada. Our newest project is the Canadian Latvian Virtual Museum, which will be a website on our website. Sorry. Muzeja mērķis ir stāstīt par Kanādas latviešiem. Tas ir par to, kā mēs te nonācām, kāpēc te nonācām, kā mēs te kopā dzīvojām un ko mēs te darījām. So the goal of the museum is to tell the story and stories of Canadian Latvians, or Latvian Canadians. Like, that could be a whole discussion point. It's about how we came to be here, why we came to be here, how we lived together, what we did together as a community. At the moment, there are 6 sections. Are you seeing You are seeing our website there, a screenshot of our website. If you see those rather small letters across the top, those are the 6 sections that we have right now. The first from the left is the Road to Canada, and we are looking at what was the experience of our parents and grandparents, and some of you, as you left Latvia, where you went, and what it was like coming to Canada. And we have some interesting stories there already. So I've also left flyers on the table so you can look this up at home. And I hope, my main point here is to invite you to contribute, to look at your photo albums, to tell us your stories. Some of them are startling. Then there is a section on the early years in Canada, one on the Latvian National Federation in Canada and advocacy on behalf of Latvia, a section on youth, a section on community, and we're missing the section on the far right that is cultural heritage. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I would be happy to take questions. Suggestions, thoughts. Is this a good idea?
Can I talk? Datsa, I have a question.
Yes.
We were thinking that hopefully you could come here and people could give you their photos or you could scan them in. Could you talk about that, please?
Yes, absolutely. We already did that in the fall. I will be available here, I won't say every Thursday. We can receive your photographs, we can scan them, and return them to you if you like. And a question that is still unanswered is how we will archive the photographs and materials that you contribute to the site.
Okay, Datsa, could you please give us some examples of some photos that have been so exciting and can inspire people in the room to bring in their photos, please?
All right, I do have another set of images. This is from a gallery in the Road to Canada section. Can you see these photographs, or are they too small? If you look at it at home on your computer, you can click on the images and they will enlarge and they will have a caption. So the top pictures, the first four, those are pictures taken by my grandfather in Berlin in the summer of 1945. And I have a story to tell about that, about how on May 8th, my grandfather traded his radio. His radio was his most important possession until that date, because it was important to know where the Russians were. And he traded it for a Voigtlander camera and started taking pictures in Berlin. Today, I have to say this is a stark reminder of what war was like. And for those warmongers today, I think it's a good reminder that that is a place we'd like to not return to. The second row is the first image on the left is the photograph of the gates of Camp Arolson, where Jānis Ivsiņš lived for several years. The other pictures are Camp Oxford in the British zone of occupation and the confirmation class. So part of the point is to show that even as people lived as displaced persons, as refugees, they did their best to carry on a normal life, and they worked tremendously hard to create a positive environment for their children. In the bottom row, the second picture from the left, that's the Camp Oxford choir led by Haralds Berino, who later came to Canada, who was also a composer. And then the next two pictures are pictures from the ship coming to Canada. The picture with the individuals wearing the life vests, in the middle on the left is Peters Broks, and on the right is Valdis Galviņš. And the picture that I'm covering up there partially, the second person from the left is Rita Auziņa. A surprising number of people have pictures from this ship, this voyage to Canada, which took 8 days in those days. So please look in your albums. I firmly believe that there's lots to be found there.
Thank you, Datsa. Oh, we have one question right here, please.
I want to bring up another archive, Senmantu Krātuve, which we have and which is also being digitalized, so that all the artifacts that are in our basement will be available to people doing research on ancient artifacts. Some of the items we have are over 100 years old. Thank you.
That's a terrific project, and in that section that's called Cultural Heritage, there will be a section on the Latvian artisans of Canada. And I hope that you will share some of those images with us on this page.
Just one final thing, Datsa,
Yep.
Could you please remind everybody of the website where they can find more information?
I don't want to get it wrong. Look on the sheet on your table. I think it's muzeis.lnaka.net. Did I get that right? Yep. Okay, thanks so much. Our email address is there too.
Paldies. Okay. All right. So, welcome to this afternoon's program. I actually met our Honorary Consul to Nova Scotia, Ingrīda Šķetris, at the Hamilton November 18th event, and Viesturš was there as well, so that's when we started putting together this exciting program for today. Probably everybody knows Pier 21 in Halifax, which is where most Latvians entered Canada after the war, and some of them stayed in Halifax and Nova Scotia, and that's why we're here today to hear about that. So we are also very excited that Ingrīda Šķetris has done such a beautiful job of reaching out to people in Nova Scotia, so welcome everybody who's in Nova Scotia. And in addition, we have Julie Langille, which is the Chief of Protocol for the Government of Nova Scotia, online today with us. We hope to have Dawn Mikaluk, who recently published the book, The Orders of the Republic of Latvia. Dawn is in the Canadian Navy and loves symbols and decided that he had to write a book about Latvian orders. There's a review of this book in the latest Latvia America, and we will also provide that information to everybody here. We're also hoping to have our ambassador, Kaspars Ozoliņš, online, and if he is, welcome to this event. So our guest speakers today are Ingrīda Šķetris, who ended up living in Nova Scotia because she fell in love with the ocean, and has been honorary consul since 2012. And our main speaker today is Viesturs Zariņš, who we've met several times here. He's talked about sports, he's talked about beer, and he's presented on Tris and on several of the books that he's written about Latvians in various parts of Canada. So I will now invite Viesturs Zariņš up. He will be speaking, and we're on a time limit, as we always are, so hopefully by the end we will have time for questions. Andres Zintars will be walking around with a microphone, so please think of questions you have for Ingrīda and Viesturs. Viesturs.
Okay, am I connected? Yes. So, all right, Labdien, good afternoon. The title of the presentation today is Nova Scotia Latvian Connections, Arrival, Haven, and Home. And as Mara said, I'll be presenting, and Ingrīda will take over part of the presentation later on. So, let's start off with a question for all of you here. Raise your hands. How many of you, your parents, or your grandparents came to Canada through Halifax in Nova Scotia? Most of the people here have raised their hand. I don't know how many have raised their hand online. So this is a story that is a personal story. It is a story that's important for our community. It's a story that's important for Canadian society at large. So first of all, where is Nova Scotia? I think most of you probably know, but Nova Scotia is a Canadian province on the Atlantic. It is 86% the size of Latvia, so a bit smaller. It has 1,037,700 inhabitants, roughly. That's about 2/3 of the number of people that live in Latvia. Halifax is the largest city in the Atlantic provinces, all 4 of them, and just over 500,000 people live in the Metro Halifax area. Somewhat similar to the situation in Latvia, where there's a heavy concentration of the population of the country in the Riga area. And Halifax is a 2-hour flight east of Toronto. So you see Toronto, Ottawa, Boston, Halifax, Nova Scotia. It is quite some distance, and if you wanted to drive there, some of you have done that, it probably is a good day or a day and a half to get to Halifax. So, about the book. In 2024, I published this book, Nova Scotia Latvian Connections. So it is a story. It is our story, but it's not just a story about history. It's also a story about survival and also about our future in this country. The story was documented in my book and published in 2024 with support, generous support from various organizations, Daugavas Vanagi in Canada, Toronto branch of Daugavas Vanagi, the Latvian National Federation in Canada, Education and Cultural Foundation, the Pēbelā Cultural Foundation and Council, the Toronto chapter of Latvian Fraternity Talvi, and the Dr. Ingrīda Šķetris Remembrance Fund in Hamilton. The book is available for sale at Let's Shop and also at LAPA, Latviešu pasaules, Latvians in the World Museum and Research Center in Riga. And if you stay to the end, there will be a door prize. This book will be given to someone here if you stay to the end. So how's that for motivation? All right, so how many Latvians live in Nova Scotia? So this is taken from the Canadian Census data. In 1941, there was only one self-declared Latvian by ethnicity in Nova Scotia, unlike Montreal, Toronto, and the western provinces. And it's very possible that that person was a Paulus Grumhold. In 2021, the last Canadian census, and census are taken every 5 years now, there were 495 self-declared people in Nova Scotia who identified Latvian as their ethnic identity or ancestry. out of 28,140 in Canada. If we look at mother tongue, it was 50 by mother tongue out of 4,430, and only five who speak Latvian at home on a consistent, regular basis out of 880 across the country. So the numbers are even smaller in the other three Atlantic provinces of New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. So if the numbers are so small, why talk about the Nova Scotia Latvian story? A number of reasons. Halifax welcomed thousands of post-war Latvian refugees to Canada. The majority headed west inland to Montreal, to Toronto, further out west, but some stayed in Nova Scotia for a year or two to fulfill their labor contract obligations, while others stayed in the province for good. A noteworthy group of cultural figures from Latvia settled in Nova Scotia and neighboring New Brunswick. They made a huge contribution to the cultural life of Atlantic Canada and some to other provinces like Ontario and Alberta. In later years, the universities of Nova Scotia, primarily Dalhousie University, attracted academics of Latvian descent. And after Latvia regained independence in 1991, Nova Scotia has had a series of cultural, political, and sports connections with Latvia, more so than most smaller Latvian communities in Canada and the United States. So it's important that we know the Nova Scotia Latvian story. Nova Scotia had connections to Latvia even before World War II. So here you see a flyer on the left from Baltic American Line and a advertisement in Strādnieku avīze on the right, workers' newspaper, from July 10th, 1921. There were regular passenger ship sailings from Liepāja on Latvia's west coast to Halifax and on to New York City that date back to the Russian Empire in the early 1900s, all the way through to the late 1930s, with a pause during World War I. Latvia has also had honorary consuls in various parts of Canada, as well as Newfoundland and Labrador when it was a dominion before becoming part of Canada. And the earliest consul in Nova Scotia was William Curry, who served in that position from 1926 to 1933. He was followed by entrepreneur Philip L. Whitman on the left from 1933 to 1963. That's a 30-year span, and it covers years when Latvia was under Soviet occupation, when an honorary consul was more symbolic than anything else, but it was a reaffirmation that Canada did not recognize the illegal occupation of Latvia by the Soviet Union. And having honorary consuls in countries like Canada during the Soviet occupation was an irritant to the Soviet Union. And then, as Mara said, Professor Dr. Ingrīda Šķetris has been honorary consul of Latvia in Nova Scotia, or to Nova Scotia, from 2012. So let's move on to the story of the refugees. So thousands of Latvian refugees from displaced person camps of Germany, as well as Sweden, arrived by ship in Halifax and were processed at Pier 21, comparable to Ellis Island in the United States in New York, which is now, Pier 21, the Canadian Museum of Immigration. Most of those who arrived stayed in Nova Scotia only for several days and then headed inland, destined for 1 or 2 year labor contracts on farms, factories, mines, lumber camps, or as hospital workers or domestics. Others stayed in Nova Scotia for several years, and some stayed for good. So, if you were in displaced persons camps in Germany, when countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela started to accept refugees, life was fairly good. The International Refugee Organization organized evacuations and shipments to those new host countries, and the refugees arrived in relative comfort. Those in Sweden, however, were left to fend for themselves. They did what they could. Boats were rented or purchased, some as small as motorized schooners, to head across the ocean to get as far away as possible from the Soviet threat. And there were a number of tragic stories, and at least one boat with 60 Latvian and Estonian refugees was lost at sea. Some who made it had harrowing tales of survival, and among them were Toronto Latvian community stalwarts Rolands and Emily Bērziņš. And Rolands, in fact, was the first president of the Toronto Latvian Pensioners Association when it was founded. And I want to read an excerpt from my book, and this is taken from Emily Bērziņš's article in the news bulletin, the magazine published by the Toronto Latvian Society, Toronto latviešu biedrība, about 20 years ago. And the article is much longer, it's worth reading. But let me read the part that I've taken out. In 1949, two enterprising Latvians in Sweden purchased a motorized schooner named the Amanda. It set sail from Gothenburg, Sweden, on July 8, with 31 Latvian refugees on board, including children and an 18-month-old infant. They had to pay for their passage. The crew consisted of the owners and a seaman who was the captain. The Amanda stopped in Falmouth, England, and then in the Azores before heading across the Atlantic, where it ran into a number of storms. First, the motor gave out, and the later winds ripped the sails apart. The vessel floundered, and it was a small 40-foot vessel. The vessel floundered, tossing in the ocean. Food and water were running low. There was no radio to call for help. One night, in desperation, several potato sacks were lighted as an SOS signal. It was picked up by a passing Spanish tanker whose crew alerted United States authorities. The next morning, a United States aircraft located the vessel and made several low passes. The airplane returned that evening and circled the vessel. The captain on the boat used a flashlight to communicate visually with the aircraft using Morse code. They were told that help would be coming once the waves died down. The aircraft was their guardian angel and returned for several days until a Coast Guard ship could arrive. When it did, a line was first used to ferry sacks of warm soup in cans to those on the schooner. Afterwards, a sick mother and her child were evacuated. A cable was then attached to the bow, and the schooner was towed towards Halifax, 770 kilometers to the northeast. The Canadian Coast Guard took over 290 kilometers from Halifax, bringing the vessel into port on August 23rd. The press was waiting. It was a sensational story that could have ended tragically. Now, because they came from Sweden, most of those refugees did not have any documents allowing them into Canada, so they were illegals. Okay? And they were interned for several months until finally they were let go and were allowed to proceed and build their lives in Canada. And the two sons of Rolands and Emily are here in the hall today, Elmas and Guntis. So shown on the left is a picture of the USS Walnut, United States ship Walnut, a converted minesweeper, which arrived in Halifax on December 13th, 1948. It also came from Sweden. It left on November 17th with 347 refugees, 10 of whom were Latvians. It lost power. It also lost power 320 kilometers offshore and was towed to Halifax, this time all the way by the Canadian Coast Guard. So the stories of arrival were very different depending on where you came from. So among the refugees were Latvians who enriched the cultural life of Atlantic Canada. These were artists, musicians, composers, conductors who already had made a name for themselves on the stages, not just in Latvia, but in Europe, in Paris, in Berlin, and other places. On the left, we have Theodors Brils, a tenor, an opera singer, and he became teacher at the Nova Scotia Opera Association as well as the co-founder of the Latvian Relief Association that I'll mention in a moment. Jānis Kalniņš, conductor in various New Brunswick orchestras and a lecturer and composer. In the middle, Jānis Kalējs, violinist, professor, and dean at the Acadia University, and his wife, pianist Felicita Kalēja. Over, Alfred Strombergs, composer, conductor, and lecturer, founder of the predecessor of the Halifax Symphony, conductor of the orchestra at the gala event for then Princess, later Queen Elizabeth II, when she was in Halifax, later moved to Toronto and on to Edmonton. And on the right, Maris Vatra, author, composer, correspondent, and opera singer with the Nova Scotia Opera Association, co-founder of the Latvian Relief Association, one of the first presidents of our national organization, jaunākajā, and he later moved to Toronto. And Brilts and Vatra set up the Latvian Relief Association, and they would go out and meet every ship that came into Halifax with Latvian refugees. They would help them with documents, translation, orientation to make sure that their first days in Canada did not go awry. And just as a sidebar, one of the comments I've heard actually quite often while I was preparing this book is, well, when my family came to Canada as refugees or immigrants, no one helped them. But these days we bend over backwards to refugees and immigrants, and that's not really fair. But it's a bogus argument. It's an apples to orange comparison. Canada at the end of the 40s and Canada today is very different, not just for immigrants and refugees, but also for Canadians. We didn't have subsidized health care back in the 40s, about pensions, all those things. So it isn't a question of preferential treatment. It is rather one that we treat the immigrants and refugees the same way we treat ourselves, be it in the 40s, 50s, or now in the 2020s. Other Latvians that enriched the life of Atlantic Canada, this time in ballet. So dancers, a couple, Irene Apinis, Juris Gottschalks, established the Halifax Conservancy School of Ballet. And in 1951, after they had moved to Toronto, they were the first principal dancers of a newly founded National Ballet of Canada. In the middle, Halifax Ballet Performance, and the two ladies on the right in the front were Skaidīte Skujiņš and Hilda Strombergs, wife of musician, composer Strombergs. And on the right, we have Mirza Grikis Dambergs, who established and for many years ran a private school of ballet in Halifax. And she, in fact, starred in Paris, in Berlin, and other places in Europe before the war. And there were others. There were also 3 generations of Kunstzinš architects in Halifax. So the older gentleman in the picture on the left is Pauls Kunstzinš. He was an acclaimed pre-war architect in Latvia, the dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Latvia, and one of the creators of the ethnographic Brīvdabas muzejs on the outskirts of Riga that many of you have seen. He joined his son, Andris Kunstzinš, on the left in the picture, who was an architect and started his career in Halifax. When Pauls Kunstzinš joined him in Halifax, he worked for a couple of years, but he was well into his 60s at this point. But he produced several books, one of them a massive definitive book called Latvijas Latvian Homestead. It's in the library here. It's about 1.5 inches thick, and it really is a definitive architectural study of traditional Latvian homesteads. Paul's brother, not pictured, Haralds Kunstzinš, was the 3rd architect in the family. He also came to Halifax late in his life. Andres' daughter, who might be on the Zoom call today, she is a retired architect. So 3 generations of Kunstzinš, and Ingrīda later on will show you some of the architectural works. There was also contract labor on farms. Most had to go out west to Manitoba, Alberta, Ontario, but there were those who fulfilled their contractual labor obligations on farms in Nova Scotia. And there are 2 families here, but I think many of you know the Greenbergs and the Wagner's families who ended up in Toronto. And in the top right picture, you see the Wagner's family and their three sons. On the left at the back is Valdis Wagner's, who unfortunately is no longer with us. In the middle in the back is Oldest, who I think lives in the Chatham area. And the little guy in the front, no longer little, is Martin Wagner's in Niagara-on-the-Lake. In the school picture, you see the Greenberg's family. The girl on the left that's circled is Varsberg Kunze in Chicago. One over is Valda Adlers, who lives in Oakville, and then her two brothers. The picture on the bottom right, the Greenberg's men, and there were several brothers there, are playing cards, probably Zolit. So Jan's corpse, take note, please. And the gentleman who's sort of looking at us is Polkved Silgiles, who lived in Nova Scotia, was a key member of the Daugos Vanag Latvian Relief Veterans Organization, who then moved to Oshawa when he retired to live with his daughter. So they fulfilled their 1 or 2 year contractual obligations in Nova Scotia, and the Greenberg's family actually moved and farmed in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, and the Wagners settled in Toronto. There were also farmers who stayed, and they were the Yesens, Balodis, and Rieks families who stayed and purchased rundown farms, and they were successful farmers. And at least one of the farms, the Balodis farm, pictured on the right, is still run by the family's third generation. On the left, you see Andres Yesens selling his products in the 1950s at a farmer's market. Interestingly enough, in 1935, he had played for Latvia's men's hockey team at the World Championships. I think they were in Davos or in Bavaria, and he was the top scorer. He became a farmer, and he passed away in the 50s. Nova Scotia has also attracted academics of a later generation, for the most part, to its universities. So on the left, no longer with us, is Ojas Biskups, architect and professor at Dalhousie University. He had been born in Latvia and studied in Canada and the United States. Next over, our co-presenter today, Ingrīda Šķetris, pharmacy professor at Dalhousie University. She was born in Ontario and in fact started her studies at the University of Toronto. In the middle is Vita Plume. Many of you probably know her. Textile artist and University of North Carolina professor emerita. That means she's retired and retired in a distinguished manner. She now lives and works both in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. She was born in the 50s in Montreal. One more over, Ian Folkens. He was born in Nova Scotia, recently retired. I think it's early retirement because he's nowhere near 60. Physics and climate studies professor at Dalhousie University. He is now living in Latvia with his wife, who is from Latvia, and they have a family of, I think, 3 or 4 children who are probably now in their teens, and they have moved back to Latvia. And the last gentleman on the right is Dr. Juris Lazovskis. He's a recent arrival. He has had a medical practice in Sydney, Nova Scotia since 2003. He's also an assistant professor, I believe, at Dalhousie. And since the start of 2024, he's been the president of LASA, the Latvian Doctors and Dentists Association, that's worldwide, including doctors, dentists, medical practitioners in Latvia and abroad. And he studied in Latvia and the United States before coming to Nova Scotia, and there are also others. Military service in Atlantic Canada. Canada's Latvians have served at Canadian Army and Navy bases in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And pictured on the left is Major, who was later a colonel, Sigurds Andersons, in 1967, escorting Canada's Governor-General Roland Michener through the honor guard of the Black Watch Royal Highlands Regiment, the Canadian Forces Base Gagetown, near Fredericton in New Brunswick. Andersons was born in Latvia. Later, he commanded Canada's reserve troops, all of Canada's reserve troops in Atlantic Canada. His base then was Halifax. and he concluded his career as Canada's military attaché to Australia and New Zealand, and there were also others. A few pictures of community life in Halifax in the 1950s and 60s. On the left is a confirmation in 1959. There was no resident Latvian minister there, so visiting Latvian ministers, in this case Viesturš Zariņš from Montreal, handled the proceedings. In the bottom picture, circled is Archbishop Kārlis Kundziņš, brother of architect Kārlis Kundziņš, and the Archbishop was the head of the Latvian church abroad, and he visited Halifax in 1965. There was also controversy. Ieva Jasins, daughter of Andrēs Jasins, as a 22-year-old student, ran as a New Democratic Party, NDP party candidate in the federal riding of Cape Breton Highlands Consul in the 1968 election, which is the Trudeau-mania year, and she lost heavily. She had also, as a student activist, along with others, accepted a paid trip to the Soviet Union, which was a propaganda trip from Moscow. Her intent was she hoped she could see her family left in Latvia, which didn't happen. And the story was picked up by the Toronto correspondent of Likes, the newspaper out of New York, and she was lambasted. The headline says, Ieva with Moscow's culture. And yet she was just a student activist running for a Social Democratic Party, the first Canadian Latvian to ever run for office in Canada. Nova Scotia Latvians also supported the restoration of Latvia's independence. And here we have Black Ribbon Day ceremonies in Halifax on August 23rd, 1988, attended by members of all political parties, Liberal, Progressive Conservatives, and New Democratic Party, covered by local media, and circled is architect Roberts Dambergs, who grew up in Halifax. He's now in Latvia, but he joined our national organization, Laikā, our political team, as an advisor, and played a fairly important role helping garner Canada's support for Latvia's independence. There are also later connections with Latvia, politics. On the left, Dalhousie Russian literature professor Ieva Vitinš, a Latvian originally from the States. I think she was born in Latvia or maybe during the war outside of Latvia. She's presenting a flower bouquet to President Vaida Vīka Freiberga at a banquet that the Latvians in Nova Scotia and Halifax held for the president after she received an honorary doctorate from Dalhousie University in 2007. In the middle is Dalhousie University, now retired professor Barry Lesser. He headed up a multi-year Baltic economic management training program initiated in 1994. It was supported by the government of Canada and attended by high-ranking officials from the Baltic states. And on the right, there's something called the Halifax International Security Forum, held every year. Picture in 2019, and Latvia's then Minister of Defense, Artis Pabriks, is seated listening to the proceedings. More connections. In 2019, Halifax Latvians met with Latvia's ambassador to Canada, Kārlis Ehenbaums, and his wife, and they were on an official visit there, but met with the Latvians there. And in this picture, you see Ingrīda, the Honorary Consul of Latvia, and on the right, I forgot the gentleman's name, but he is the Honorary Consul of Estonia to Nova Scotia. We also have connections today. Since 2017, Canada has led NATO's multinational battle group based in Latvia with troops from 14 NATO members that now include Sweden as a deterrent to Russian aggression. Similar NATO groups, albeit with less number of participating nations, are stationed in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and so on. And Canada is committed to leading that at least until 2029, as a deterrent to Russian aggression. And Canadian troops, there are now 2,600, 500 at headquarters in Riga, the rest primarily at Camp Adaži, and they rotate there on a 6-month basis. And you see on the left It was the turn of members of the 5th Canadian Division based in Gagetown, New Brunswick, to say their goodbyes to their families and head to Latvia. And I think we're all grateful as a community, as a country, for Canada's support. We have shared values that need to be defended. Sport Connections, 2008. Halifax hosted, along with Quebec City, World Hockey Championships. Well, 1,000 Latvians attended, 800 from Latvia, and we occupied one end of the Halifax Forum, loud and boisterous, and locals were taking art pictures because they had never seen something like that. And in 2023, the World Junior Championships were co-hosted in Halifax and Moncton, and a group of Latvians from Halifax went to Moncton, 2.5-hour drive, to support Latvia's juniors. There have been other sports championships. On the left, the Yacht Spaniel from Latvia attending the Sea Festival in Halifax. On the right, the World Floorboard Championships. There have been Sprint Canoe Kayak Championships in the Halifax area. So the connections are there. And there's also recent arrivals in the Atlantic provinces, not many because the job opportunities are fewer, but there's a group of about 20 in the Sussex, New Brunswick area who have found jobs. And they're somewhat isolated and not engaged in our broader community, but they do get together, have personal outings, celebrate Jaunu, and set up stands for multicultural festivals. And you see a group of them, a picture was sent to me, hiking on a mountain in New Brunswick. And I think at this point, Ingrīda, you can take over and just give me prompts when you want me to move the slides.
First of all, I would like to thank MARA and TLPA for all of the ability for us in Nova Scotia to participate by Zoom. And also, I'd like to thank Viesturs for the work that he has done on the book, and all of the Nova Scotia Latvians who have provided photographs and responded to my very many emails. In 2014, Zintra Geka came to Halifax, and along with her husband, Viesturš Zariņš. And Peter was staying at my son's apartment, and he was going to spend the time composing. But I thought Viesturš Zariņš is in town, and so that it would be important to have him present at the Faculty of Music at Dalhousie. And I introduced him to Walter Kemp and to Peter Togney, composers, and they got so that he would have his speaker in residence at Scotia Festival of Music. In 2019, acclaimed violinist Gidon Kremer came to present in Lunenburg, and Ambassador Karls Eckenbaums came as well. Next slide. And Zintra Geka in 2014 called me and asked if there would be 5 Latvians who had come from Latvia to Nova Scotia that she could interview. I found 5 people, and she came and she did the film God's Lost Sparrows. And in 2016, she presented the film to Dalhousie film students and the broader community. Next slide. And Paulus Kunziņš was Dean of Architecture in Latvia. On the left, you can see that he did a number of buildings there in Valka, a school. And his son Andris studied in the Baltic University in Germany. And this is a gym that he did at Dalhousie that is award-winning. Next slide. On the left, you see the Killa Memorial Library, co-designed by Ojārs Biskaps, who was also a professor of architecture at Dalhousie. It's an example of brutalist architecture. It was opened in 1971, and it also won an award. And on the right, you can see a building that Inara Kunzinch helped design. She worked for Arthur Erickson in Vancouver. Next slide. The schools for Latvian children have been intermittent in Halifax. Myself and some other mothers provided some Latvian lessons to our children, and they danced Tootling Togating for the mayor at City Hall at a multicultural event. We had a short summer camp at the Baluadis farm, and the children have maintained some connections into adulthood from those times. Ralph Dreimanis and Ilse Plitniece did a more formal school where they had auseklitis, and in the picture you can see Ralph's granddaughter playing the kokle. Next slide. We have, over the last years, had a flag raising on November 18th every year at City Hall, and the mayor has had a proclamation. Next slide. And we have celebrated Jāņi in Halifax for over 75 years, for the first decades at the Auniņu homestead, and more recently at Hummingbird Vineyard, which is the Herbert homestead. Paldies.
Paldies. So to wrap up, let's briefly talk about identity and the future as reflected by the Halifax, Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada Latvian story. So the number of Latvians in the province has always been small. The number of children and youths has even been smaller and not large enough. There hasn't been critical mass to establish sustained local activities for them, like folk dance groups and other things like we have here in Toronto. Halifax, Nova Scotia are far from larger Latvian communities in Canada and the United States. And it's actually very difficult for members of small, distant communities to come to a place like Toronto, Viesturš, to actually feel at home and engaged. Even though I did met one of my contributors for the book at Viesturš in 2024, she was helped by the fact she had relatives here. Almost all, but not all, there have been a few, but almost all Latvian marriages in Nova Scotia since the 50s have been with Canadians. The overwhelming majority of younger generations have assimilated and few speak Latvian. But there are Latvians of different generations who have visited Latvia, some frequently and some live there. The pandemic created opportunities for Latvians in places like Halifax to attend events like church services and these presentations in Toronto. The Nova Scotia Latvian community is sustained by a small group of boomer generation ladies and even a smaller number of men from that generation, so its future is somewhat uncertain. But Latvian food is still being prepared and pirog is still being baked on festive occasions, so long live pirog. So here is a group of Nova Scotia Latvian Canadian ladies in 2023. Ambassador Ozoliņš, who's the current ambassador, visited Nova Scotia in October 2024 on a formal visit, and he's shown presenting my book to the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Arthur LeBlanc. And currently I'm working with Ingrīda Šķetris and Ilga Leja, who's a retired librarian, to get the book into the university and public libraries of Nova Scotia and neighboring provinces like I did for my Manitoba book, but we're running into some unexpected challenges that we're trying to work our way through. I'm a very visual person, so to close off, let's see what Nova Scotia looks like. So this is Halifax from the air, and on the right you see the British citadel built in the 18th century. Canadian Forces Base Halifax, Canada's East Coast Naval Base, right in downtown Halifax. A lot of fishing heritage, sea heritage in Nova Scotia. Here's Peggy's Cove. I'm sure some of you have been there. Many fishing villages like that, very picturesque. Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia is actually three parts to it. The mainland, Cape Breton Island, which is only a few kilometers by causeway from the mainland. It's about the size of Kurzeme in Latvia, maybe a bit smaller. A lot of sea and mountains there, very picturesque, beautiful, rich heritage. Nova Scotia's history back and forth between the British and the French. Here on Cape Breton Island is 18th century French fortress Louisbourg. Nova Scotia is not just about sea and water, it also has forests, inland lakes. The third part of Nova Scotia is Sable Island, 175 kilometers offshore, 34 square kilometers. It's a national park reserve, and it's home to wild horses. And maybe I should check to see if it's still part of Canada, because maybe someone down south has eyes on Sable Island these days. And the seafaring heritage, the Blue Nose 2 schooner, a replica of the Blue Nose schooner, which in the 1930s and 20s won a lot of ocean racing awards. So, right on 40 minutes, Mara. Note that this taskmaster had me sweating all night. Okay, so after Q&A, we will have a door prize. This book will go to someone here, and I'll tell you how that'll work, but Mara, you can perhaps handle Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Viesturs. Okay. So Viesturs said, "Long live Piedage," and I remember reading something that Vida Vita Freiberg had written, that the last thing that always remains is the Piedage. Language goes, everything else, but the Piedage will stay. So thank you again. Always an excellent presentation from Viesturs. Thank you to Ingrida and everybody who's gathered in Nova Scotia. We're so glad you're with us, and please keep joining us on Thursdays. Before we go on, I just want to let you know that we've had 3 people in this room today who have upcoming presentations. Ilse Maxinga is on next Thursday. She was here to get her soup. And Mark McNamara will be presenting on February 12th. His talk is 50 years in stories and song, and he's at the back corner there right now. And Fritz Krisbergs will be presenting on February 19th. Aiz maskas unar zobeno, behind the mask with a sword. So now we'll move to Q&A. Andres Zintars is back at the back with a microphone, and we would love to take your questions. Ingrida and Viesturs will be answering. Does anybody have a question to kick off? Okay. We have one. Great.
Okay, Viestur, how long did your preparation and research for this particular book take?
Mic's not working? There. So I'd say it took about 1.5 years, and the most important thing was having boots on the ground. I mean, there's only so far you can go researching periodicals, and some of that is made easier that the Latvian National Library has digitized many, and you can access them online. But the big difference was having people, especially Ingrida in Halifax, who then introduced me to others, who fed me stories, who had fed me photographs, and so on. So it was about 1.5 years. Manitoba actually took about 6 to 7 years, so a big difference. But the Manitoba story reaches much further in the past. The Nova Scotia story, for the most part, is a post-war story, World War II story, a refugee story, and as a result, the material was easier to source.
Viestur, was the Pier 21 Museum a part of your story searches?
Yes, I was in contact with the Pier 21 Museum. A number of people, including Ingrida, alerted me to artifacts and online articles that Pier 21 has about Latvians. In fact, in the book, you'll see a couple of pictures where the ambassador, then Ambassador Carlos Ehrenbaums, is at the museum, and he's looking at, for example, a chest of things that the family brought over with them. And there are various other things like pictures. I think the 50,000 and 100,000 symbolic refugee that Canada accepted after the war. Latvians were chosen in both cases, so there's photographs of that. So yeah, again, having boots on the ground, having local material is so important to this because there's only so far you can get from a distance.
Any more questions?
Any questions from Zoom, Zoom participants?
Thank you as well for your presentation on the Latvian archival and museum materials. My background is slightly different. Mine is Lithuanian, and we do have an archive and museum in Mississauga. I believe you might be aware of Dainora or Danguolė who administer, and we've had various displays involving religious, cultural, folk, and a variety of displays. So I encourage you to as well keep that link because they have the facility right here in the city in case you wanted to join forces.
I've been to the Lithuanian Center in Mississauga on Stavebank, I think. I've seen the museum, the archives. It's about as big as this room here. It's a massive setup. I've also been to the Estonian, I think it's called Vemu Center at Tartu College on Bloor Street in downtown Toronto. And I think we're lagging behind as Latvians, which is, I think, why the initiative that LNRK and Dace Weinberg is heading about the virtual museum is so important. We also have the Canadian Latvian Clam Center on the second floor, but it's more of a repository of things that have come up. It's not really a museum in the proper sense. There's also the books that I've published, and there have also been a number of publications on Alberta Latvians independent of what I've been doing, and they go back about 40 years. So our story in Canada is a bit of a patchwork setup, and I would really urge all of you to do what Dace invited you to do. Bring your photos. But when I went out to Manitoba on my first trip, after I connected with descendants of Latvians there and the local historical society about an hour and a half northeast of Winnipeg, I presented on the history of Latvia because the descendants there and a little community called Lac de Bunny of about 2,000 people, about a fifth of them have a Latvian background going back 2 or 3 or 4 generations. The admission to that evening was you bring photos, you bring documents from your closets, from your attics, and we set up a scanner, and we had such a turnout. 60 people came, and a lot of material was collected. A lot of material has also been lost, and it's important that it is not lost. So, take up Dace's offer, bring your photos, bring documents. My book on the Nova Scotia Latvians has some documents that Martin Švagl has provided to me, of entry documents into Canada, of documents from DP camps. Those are so important. And these days, with the ability to digitize material, it makes it that much easier. The originals are important, but the fact you can digitize means it's so much easier to work and distribute and share. So, yeah, thank you for that. The Lithuanians have a great setup.
Thank you. We have two comments from Zoom. First one, it's not a question, but an item of interest. Ralphs, who I believe is online with us every single Thursday, he writes, Participants may be interested to know that the Royal Canadian Navy regularly contributes specialist mine clearance divers and support vessels to multinational operations in the Baltic Sea. These teams include clearance divers from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Esquimalt, British Columbia, working alongside Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to clear historic naval mines. And I understand that Adolphus himself was a Navy diver and knows Viesturs. And the second is a question. I also from Adolphus. I'm curious about the work contracts that Latvian refugees had when they arrived in Canada. Do you know how these contracts were structured and administered?
That's a good question. I haven't seen any work contracts, so I don't have the details, but basically you had to sign up for work on farms, in mines, in lumber camps, in hospitals, factories, or as domestics. I know that we have a gentleman here, Shkepatkungs, who was contract labor in Beset, Manitoba, in the gold mine there. And that would be a great question if we had more time to ask him about what he had to sign and how all of that worked. And I think there might be a few others around also.
Viestur, I can add a little bit. I have a copy of one contract. The process was that people were screened in Germany, rather thoroughly screened, and they were coming with placements before they arrived here. And Elenaka actually played a role in finding these positions for people. They advertised in union papers and went around to farmers and asking, do you need workers? We can bring you in workers. And this was administered through the Department of Labor at the federal government. So this, and part of what the Latvian Relief Association in Halifax did was that they collected the names and the addresses of people as they arrived and where they were heading to. And that formed the basis of a I guess, not a membership list, but Elenaka inherited a list of like 12,000 names in the early 50s. And then it was a problem of tracking people after that. But Elenaka was also involved with advocating for people because they were often taken advantage of in those early years by their employers. And some of these places where they ended up working, where it was extremely dangerous work, like in hard rock mining in the north, in forestry. And aside from translation services, they actually were hiring lawyers in some cases to help people out. Anyway, when the year was up, and it seems to me that most of those contracts were on a one-year basis, although I've heard some people say 2 years, but I actually haven't seen any actual documentation of that. Then the Department of Labor sent a letter and a card, like that looked sort of like a citizenship card, that this person has completed their labor and they're now free to move someplace else and take up other employment. And we have, I think we have 2 copies of documents like that.
Am I on? Yeah. And just to add to that, there were also some earlier Latvians who had come to Canada before World War II who helped Latvian refugees find jobs. One was Dobels, I forgot his first name, Jans Dobels? Konrads Dobels in Edmonton, who I think was also the first or the second president of Elenaka, and he found work for refugees on farms in Alberta. There was also John Jones or Janis Jankiewicz, also from Alberta. And Martin Stalves, who's no longer with us from Montreal, he told me, and he actually did give me documentation of some work permit cards, probably not the right term for it, and he said that they had signed up for a 2-year labor contract in Carmen, Manitoba, working on the sugar beet fields, and there was a fair number of Latvians out there. And the farmer was withholding wages, and Martin Stalves' family took the farmer to court. They won, and they were released from the 2-year contract after 1 year. There was also a story in a Manitoba newspaper where they sent out an investigative reporter to look at conditions in the Carmen area. And some of the conditions, I think, as that's implied, albeit in a mine setting, were appalling, with unheated huts and lice and things of that sort. And I think the headline, I'd have to go back to my archives, was that third world conditions existed, only a couple of hours away from Winnipeg. So it wasn't necessarily a rosy story in all cases. There were some situations. I know my wife's family in the U.S. were very pleased and fond of the farmer that they were assigned to in Indiana, and they maintained touch with him afterwards. And in other cases, it was, let's get the heck out of here as soon as we can.
Thanks, Viestur. We're coming to the end of our afternoon, so we will give Ingrid a chance to give up some closing remarks and then move on to Viestur's door prize.
Hey, I just really wanted to thank TLPA again for including us in Nova Scotia. We're a very small community. For example, at the flag raising, sometime we might only have about 12 people. But they might drive from Sydney, which is 6 hours away, or Shelburne, which is close to 3 hours away, to participate in our events. And having the ability to connect with you in Zoom helps keep us connected to the Latvian community. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Ingrida and Viesturs and everybody in Nova Scotia. Okay, Viestur, give them the rules.
Okay. We don't have tickets, but the way it's going to work, I've written a number on this card. I'm going to give it to Mada. Mada, you can't look at it yet. And we're going to go around, and those who want to participate, shout out a number between 1 and 1,000. And the number that's closest to what I have on the card will get the book. And unless you think my autograph will devalue the book, okay, I can sign it for you. So let's start with this table here. Give me a number, 1 to 1,000. 552. 552.
A number. 1 to 1,000.
100. You break the wood. Inga proofread the book for me.
$736.
580 here.
Numărul este bine să
No more.
Numărul este bine să tūkstotis.
No, 2 consecutive.
Oh, trees.
969.
Yep, a number is 1 in 1,000? Yes. Okay.
451.
Next, okay, numărul este bine să tūkstotis.
Okay, moving on to that table and then the long table. Now, don't show it yet, Madam. The way I chose the number, those people that are close to me know I've got a favorite number. Okay? And it's the number of my birthday, which happens to be the same number as my wife Inga's birthday, which happens to be the same number as the day we met on a blind date in Cleveland. And the number is 25. So I think 26 wins. Is that the closest number? Yes, 26. So thank you very much, Paldies. Yes, it does.
Library has the book, we're just not sure if it's checked out right now. We're not sure if it's checked out, but everybody can have the opportunity to read it at the library too.
So if you're passing, who's the next? Do you want the book? Okay. Do you want me to sign it? Okay. All right. Let's get a photo. Who's taking pictures? There we go. There we go. Perfect. I expect to see it in Facebook, right?
Okay, on behalf of the LPA, Paldies, here's Paldies.
Okay, Paldies.
Okay,
Gift.
okay.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, one more time, thank you to Viesturs, and we will see you next week for Tonto Latviešu sestdienas skolas 7. gadi ar Ilzi Maksiņu. Paldies, uz redzīt!